Hello, nice to see you all here. I'm Tom Krause. I'm the chair of the Ojai Chautauqua, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. I have just a few comments, and then I will introduce our moderator, and he will introduce the panel. But first, let me just thank you all for making the trip up here to Ojai on behalf of the Ojai community. We really appreciate your being here and look forward. So over the last several years, we've had a number of these kinds of panels, starting with GMOs, and then water, and then fracking, and immigration, income inequality, and most recently, presidential politics. Across all of those programs, a question that has come up repeatedly and in almost every case is, what is the role of the news media in a free society? And has it changed? Has the role changed with changes in technology and with cable news and with the internet? Is it a different kind of role? Net, at the bottom line, are we getting better information or are we getting worse information than we used to? Everybody agrees that a free society is essential to a well-functioning democracy, but is it working? Is the free press working the way that it's supposed to? I want to read you a quote from a public commentator. "Do not fear the enemy, for your enemy can only take your life. It is far better that you fear the media, for they will steal your honor." That awful power, the public opinion of a nation, is created in America by a horde of ignorant, self-complacent simpletons. Not intended at all. So now, who wrote that and when? Mark Twain in 1873. So it isn't a new issue. And maybe Mark Twain, he was prone to hyperbole and he loved humor. Maybe he was having a bad day, or maybe he read something someone said about him that he didn't like particularly. But it does raise the question, is he right about this? Is the news media an awful power that steals honor from good people? Or is the media providing an enormous public service that sustains our democratic institutions? Now, our method of trying to get at that question is to invite people who have depth of knowledge and experience and ask them to have a friendly conversation about this subject. By friendly conversation, we don't mean we want them to agree. If they disagree, we want them to disagree. But we'd like to do that in a way that has the old notion of civil discourse kind of built in a friendly way, in a way that opens up the issue so that those of us in the audience benefit from understanding it better, that we get educated on this issue. That's what we're trying to do. That's our objective. To help us with all of this, Dan Schnurr and Cecilia Black have put this group of people together. Dan is a friend of the Ojai Chautauqua, and he has moderated a number of panels for us. He teaches at USC and UC Berkeley. He writes a column for the San Francisco Chronicle, and he has been our good friend. Please welcome Dan Schnurr.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thanks to all of you for allowing Cecile and myself to join you again for another Ojai Chautauqua. We love coming here and we love talking with you about such important issues. The only complaint we have is we think there should be more Chautauquas, so in the future we'll be doing them on a weekly basis, if that's okay with you, Tom. As much as I'd like, go with that thought, as much as I'd like that to be the case, unfortunately, it probably won't be, but nonetheless, we're very excited, and as our panel will introduce to you in just a moment, we're all very, very happy to be here with you today to have, as Tom mentioned a moment ago, a somewhat broader conversation than we've had in our previous gatherings, because in the past, we've talked about particular challenges, particular points of interest in American politics, but today we want to take a step back and not just talk about what happened in the news yesterday or the day before or what happened on the campaign trail or in Washington or in Sacramento, but to get some sense about how we as citizens inform ourselves in a democracy in the 21st century, and as Tom mentioned, how that information retrieval and dissemination process has changed over the years, and what that means for all of us. To have that conversation, we put together a tremendous panel. Before I introduce them and ask you to join me in welcoming them and thanking them, a few other thanks before we get started. First, of course, we want to thank Tom and his wife, Catherine, and we want to thank Esther and Tom Wachtel for the tremendous work and the tremendous leadership they've shown in putting together these programs for us, for the entire community. Tom, Esther, Tom, Catherine, thank you all very, very much. And although time doesn't permit us to name all the other community leaders by name who've been working with us to put these programs together, we're very fortunate to have a tremendous host committee, a really remarkable group of men and women who we were very privileged to have dinner with last night. And for all of you, thank you for everything you've done to make these programs such a success and to make us all feel so welcome. Thank you very, very much. And although time, of course, does not permit me to thank each of you individually by name, I do want to do a special shout out to our high school students who are here today, our students from Elk Grove and Villanova, who on a beautiful June day in central Southern California have decided to come and join us inside this auditorium for the conversation. It's a lot more than I would have done when I was 16 or 17 years old, so let's give them a round of applause and congratulate them for their commitment to civics and to our community. So today we're going to talk about the news media, but we don't want to talk about it just in a vacuum. As you saw when this program was promoted and marketed, we suggested that this would be a conversation not just about media, but about politics, media, and society. So our goal here today is not to talk about media as this strange alien being that, what was the quote, Tom, steals your honor? Is that what your friend Mr. Twain said? Interesting. But we want to talk about the media not as a standalone entity, but as a part of our community, and to get a better understanding of the role that the news media, print, broadcast, online, and social media plays in helping us to become a stronger community and the challenges it faces in that regard. And so for that conversation, as has been the case in the past, we're very fortunate to have a tremendous collection of individuals here with us today who I think are going to be able to lead us through a fascinating conversation. Sitting way, way down at the end of the table, where he's safe from me, almost, is our friend Bill Burton. Bill is currently in charge of California operations for the public affairs firm of SKD Knickerbocker. But if he looks or his name sounds familiar, it may be because he was the campaign spokesman for Barack Obama's presidential campaign in 2008, and then the White House deputy press secretary during Obama's first term. Bill Burton, we're very happy to have you here with us. Sitting next to Bill is also someone who I'm proud to be able to call a friend and someone who I've known for many, many years. Ken LaCourte is an 18-year veteran of the Fox News Channel. He's currently the founder of an internet news source called LCN LaCourte News, which will be posting within the next several months, and we believe will be really the next great breakthrough in online political journalism. But Ken was the head of West Coast operations for the Fox News Channel for many, many years, and I don't know anyone who has a better understanding of how news media has changed, both in the cable television and internet era. Ken, thank you so much for being here. Okay, I'm going to skip over to the gentleman sitting right next to me for a minute. John Thomas, yes, also a friend. I think you're beginning to see a trend here. John is one of the most respected Republican political consultants. Actually, I should edit that. One of the most respected political consultants, regardless of party, in Southern California. He's the founder and the president of Thomas Partner Strategies, and he is a commentator under contract for CNN. John is one of the most astute observers of politics at the California and national level. We're very, very happy to have you with us here today, John, also. Sitting next to John is Naomi Seligman, and Naomi is currently the Director of Communications for Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. But what I will tell you is this is only the latest stop on a very, very distinguished career as a respected communications and public affairs strategist for a number of progressive causes. Most notably, she's worked for the Gun Truth Project, for Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, for Media Matters, and many other respected organizations as well. Naomi, we're so glad to have you with us here today also. And finally, last but certainly not least, I skipped over Alice Walton, one, because I'm going to ask her to take the first question in our program, but also because if the other panelists don't mind, I'm going to brag a little bit about Alice Walton. Alice is currently a senior strategist for the public affairs firm in Los Angeles, California, a firm called Sunken, Eck, and Klink, and she's been in that role for a relatively short time. Prior to that, though, she covered politics for the Los Angeles Times. Prior to that, she covered politics in government and public policy for KPCC Radio. Prior to that, she founded a very, very well-known and prominent online website, City Maven, which covered Los Angeles politics more broadly and more deeply than any other media source in Southern California. But before that, he says proudly, Alice Walton was a student of mine at the University of Southern California. And so please join me in welcoming her as well. So as you can see, we got a really, really phenomenal group here. And I'm excited to get into the conversation. But before we get to that broader conversation about the media's role in our community, in our society, we were talking a little beforehand, the six of us, and we thought it wouldn't be bad to take a step back and just provide some perspective for the conversation. And for that perspective, I'm going to start with Alice, who, as a print journalist for the Times, as a broadcast journalist for KPCC, as an online journalist, as I described, really has an excellent sense of course, of how the news media works. And before we get into that broader discussion, Alice, I'm wondering if you can start us out. So for those people who haven't spent a lot of time in newsrooms, print, broadcast, or otherwise, talk a little bit about where the news comes from and how it comes to us, would you?
Yeah, well, I've always sort of thought of news as, food. People want to know where their food comes from, if it's organic, if it's locally sourced, and yet news it's like food for our brains, and people have no idea really where it's coming from if they see it on Facebook or Twitter. And we were talking about this in part because I've been out of journalism for about 5 months, and it's only now that I'm really seeing how much people either dislike journalists, don't trust them, or just really don't have a great concept of how news comes to them. I was in an Uber a couple of weeks ago, the very chatty driver, who decided at one point to start telling me what he thought about reporters, at which point I said, well, I used to be one. He did not enjoy hearing that. But he was asking me about my time at the LA Times, and he said, so when you worked there, they would let you write what you reported? They would just let you write? They didn't censor you? And to me, that sounded crazy, but to him, there had clearly been such trust eroded or misinformation that to him, it was a reasonable question to say, do they censor you when it comes time to write an article? When I was a reporter, a typical day, if I didn't already have a story lined up, would be to see what was happening that morning, and then probably spend the next 5 or 6 hours making phone calls, interviewing important people who knew information, reading reports, going through lots of documents, and then very quickly trying to organize that into a way that would be digestible to the public. And then working with an editor to make sure that the story made sense, it was spelled correctly, it had proper grammar, were there any holes in the story, things that didn't make sense, and then it went out into the world. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward, simple process, but I think the keys there are, talking to people who have the information you want, reading reports that are written by experts or people with credibility, going through documents, and then really trying to understand the greater context of whatever the story is that you're writing about. And it just sounds so simple, but I've discovered in these past couple of months that there, again, is just such mistrust or distrust of the media that simple process, people think there's something else happening there. And I know we're going to talk a lot about some of the changes in media, but it's so simple, but I think that is a good place to sort of start with. That's the process, and that's how the news comes to you, and then what happens with it after that, I think we'll talk about in a little bit.
Great. Alice, thank you very much. And just a reminder for all of you who have joined us in the past, and not a reminder, but an invitation for those of you who are newer to us. You've all noticed that you have cards and writing instruments at your chair. And in about 30, 40 minutes or so, we'll collect those cards. And so if you have questions for Alice or the other panelists, please write them down, and I'll do my best to ask as many of them as possible. And if you do have more specific questions for Alice, for example, on how a good news reporter or news editor collects and reports and disseminates the news, I know she'll be happy to talk about it in more detail. So Ken, let me come to you now. Alice gave us a very good overview of how the process works. What I'd love you to do, as a veteran and a leader in cable news, and now as someone who's taking this bold step into online news, talk a little bit about how changes in media technology have changed the process that Alice just described.
Well, I thought it changed, but now that I'm hearing Mark Twain says the exact same thing as your Uber driver, maybe this is all a circular thing. So I started the Fox News Channel about 20 years ago, and for the last 10 years I ran the .com on that. And one of the things that Fox News was founded on was the belief, and it's an arguable belief, but it's a belief that we and others felt that most of the news media had a pretty left bias on things. And so this channel came in, and Fox News was it was pre-internet. It was the first kind of major national publication that had looked at the news from a different point of view. And I think that's important because you don't have to be biased just to have, everybody has a point of view. If we were in if we were reporting a newspaper or a cable station for India, we would talk about different things than we would talk about America. We all look at, if we see an accident on the corner and you see it on one corner and I'm in one car, being straightforward and talking the fair news and the fair facts of what happened, there is going to be a different point of view, and you're going to start with different things. So at Fox, for instance, one of the things that we would do is we would prioritize different stories differently than others. The environment is a good, so there's some let's say energy practice that is harming the environment in certain ways. There's a lot of ways to look at that story, and it's, do you start with the spotted owl and seeing the dead ones on the ground, or do you start with the lumberjack guy who was fired and he can't raise his family? There's a lot of ways to present and fairly present the same story. But to your question, a lot of this that news media is reflective of how we communicate with each other. And that's changed radically just in our lifetimes. I mean, we've existed from a time where there were 3 national news broadcasts on television, and that was it. And those 3, they were all 3 guys who all worked within a walking distance of each other in New York City. And you combine their points of view along with maybe the Washington Post and the New York Times, and that's where we as America got our national news. Cable came, and Ted Turner with CNN did a masterful thing of making cable 24 hours, or news on cable 24 hours. Fox News came probably 15, 20 years after that, and it was a brand new medium that changed around from our newspapers. Our newspapers would come and put a 1,200-word article on something. Well, not a whole lot of people want to hear that type of news on television. They want faster things. They want a little bit more debate. And we've seen that kind of evolve over the years where people's opinion on news are now really what drives most viewers. I mean, the most popular parts of cable news aren't the news reporting necessarily. It's what does this person who I kind of trust, and whether that's Rachel Maddow or Bill O'Reilly or whoever that is, that's become a more popular, more profitable element. And then at the same time now we're popping in the internet, which has just opened up a massive amount of the ability for thousands of people to report in a very real sense. I was talking about how I was watching a demonstration up in Berkeley. The major nets didn't have it on. I saw a guy out there with a little handheld walking around talking to people. I didn't know who he was. He didn't have any training, but I got a lot of interesting information out of him, and I saw that. So part of this is we've seen the way that human beings communicate with each other just radically change.
Ken, thanks very much. And Bill, I want to come to you now. In a little bit, I think you guys are going to be especially interested in hearing Bill talk about the work he's done as a communications and media strategist, navigating the landscape that Alice and Ken have just laid out for us. But before we get to that, I want to come to you, Bill, first for another perspective on the news media, what the media is and what its goals are. Because one of the things, and I think you and I have talked about this, that we noticed at dinner last night with our host committee, is that in addition to informing the public, most mainstream news media organizations have another critically important goal as well. And maybe you can talk about that goal and how it impacts the news that's presented to us.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate having another excuse to come to Ojai, so thank you. The thing that people need to keep in mind about news organizations, that along with their mission to disseminate information to folks and ensure that there's an informed populace, they are for-profit enterprises for the most part. And so along with reporting the news, they also have to keep their business going. And they've got executives, and those executives are watching the bottom line, and the people watching the bottom line are watching how many clicks are on stories, and what are the things that get the most attention, and what are the things that get other news sources to report on the things that they're doing. And so even though we would wish that Alice, when she was a journalist, and her colleagues of the world were just focused on how do we get the right story out to the American people or the people of the world, there's also this other thing in the back of their heads, which is, well, we also have to sell newspapers. And Ken, we were talking last night, made the great point that if you look at the evolution of how we've sold journalism, back 100 years ago, people were on street corners hollering the headlines of the front page of their papers. And whoever had the best headline was going to sell the most papers. But then as people started to get subscriptions to newspapers and they had a captive audience, quality really mattered. And so the quality of the journalism took off. And now we're moving into a new phase where, online clicks are governed by a whole series of different elements, whether it's the things that are important for people to know about what their government is doing or what other institutions in American life are doing, but also, what are Brad and Angelina up to? And what's Courtney Cox doing these days? And so you have to have a mix of, she could be here, I know she hangs out in Ojai, but you have to have a mix of the different things in order to sell papers. And as these for-profit enterprises are growing in this, as the ever-evolving economy, there has been a consolidation. And that consolidation has meant that different larger news organizations, be it News Corp with Fox or Sinclair with over 170 stations that they own around the country, it means they have this outsized impact on the information that people get. And there is certainly some political bias to some of the things that they're passing forth. For example, Sinclair just hired a former Trump spokesperson to give political commentary for their newscasts. And those stations are compelled to broadcast what that commentary is. And so I just watched his first one before I came here. And it's all about how the media has been screwing up the press briefings in the White House. And so President Trump is going to have to stop doing them so much and talk to reporters more himself because reporters are just out of control in the White House briefing room. People turn on their local news station, they're not expecting to hear something that has a conservative bent. But if you turn on a Fox affiliate or any sort of affiliate that's owned by Sinclair, you are certainly getting some editorial content baked into the news. So it's an interesting part of the evolution of news, and I know we'll get more into the partisanship later, but there you go.
So, Bill, I think you raised two really important points. One, of course, is with the exception of public broadcasting, the media is a business. And I think what you pointed out for us very helpfully, Bill, is when there is coverage of celebrities or other less substantive means, it's not simply because they are intentionally and deviously trying to dumb down the electorate, but because in order to stay in operation, in order to continue to print a newspaper, in order to continue to operate a television or a radio station or a website, they need a certain size audience in order to continue paying the reporters and editors and producers who work there. But your second point's a really interesting one also, and I'm going to come to Naomi to talk about this a little bit further. And that is that as the number of news media outlets has grown, given these advances in technology that we've been talking about, in addition to providing information, in addition to trying to attract an audience, a growing percentage of the media sources that are available to us aren't just looking to inform their audience, but to convince them, to persuade them, to build support for a particular ideology or issue set or policy set of challenges. Naomi, talk if you can for a little bit about how that change in the media landscape affects the conversation we're having.
Sure. I think we're in a pretty exciting time, actually. We're in a moment where not only aren't there 3 or 4 major news outlets that are telling us what's going on every day, but there's hundreds. And you just need to figure out what works for you. And I think organizations and folks that are fighting for issues are sort of finding out what organizations work for them. So for example, we have those organizations on the right that we're familiar with, Breitbart, who's now has a place in the White House, and Drudge, and sort of the folks we've known, Red State, other sorts of online publications like that have been on the right. And then on the left, we've had everything from the Young Turks to Daily Kos to a whole range of other progressive publications for which we've all relied on the left to sort of talk with, to help us with the megaphone that we're looking to work with. And especially, I think, in the beginning of my career, when there wasn't sort of the interwebs to run to have a direct conversation like Twitter or like Facebook, we relied on those folks to tell our stories. Right now, we have much more niche publications that are coming in to play. We have something called The Trace, which is funded by a number of gun safety advocates, and they'll cover stories around gun control. They'll cover stories around gun death, stories that may get coverage in some of the larger publications, but really won't get the drill down in those publications. And so what we're working with now is we have the capacity to tell a lot of different stories around a lot of different things. We have amazing podcasts, right? We have millions of podcasts that allow us to tell our stories. And it goes from everything, if you want to hear about crime, to politics, to Pod Save America, which are former Obama staffers, who now are the number 4 podcast in the country. And they're now telling the story around politics and speaking to millennials about what's going on, where we are in this moment. So I think I actually think it allows us to have a much greater engagement with things we care about, a much greater engagement to hear the stories that we're looking to hear, and also for those of us who are trying to get a message out, a lot more opportunity to tell the stories that we think need to get out there.
Right, and in just a few minutes, I want to come back to Naomi and hear a little bit about how you're doing that on behalf of Mayor Garcetti, given the platform he has as mayor of one of the nation's largest cities. Before we dig deeper into the conversation, though, I want to make sure we get one more perspective, and that's from John Thomas, because of course, John, we've talked a lot about news media for the last 20 minutes or so, but it's worth remembering that the news media, newspapers, broadcast, online, isn't the only place where we get information. We get information from a lot of other places and a lot of sources as well. And it's worth remembering that those other sources can really impact the way we think about the issues of the day too. John, can you talk a little bit about those other sources and how it impacts how we perceive the news that comes from the more traditional media?
Sure. Before I get to that, I would like to piggyback off something Naomi and Alice were talking about. To me, as a political campaign practitioner, it really is an exciting time because we have so many more channels. And I think what's frustrating to the big news organizations is that they don't have control of the cycle anymore like they used to. They used to have a monopoly on information. They don't anymore because there are so many different channels. Just an example in the LA Times, when I first started working local campaigns, the LA Times had a huge city desk bureau. Now they have just a few staffers, and so I don't even bother with them anymore. In fact, when Alice used to run the City Maven, when I wanted to find out what was going in City Hall, I would look at Alice before I would look at the LA Times because I knew I'd get better coverage than the LA Times. So I really think it's an exciting thing. But Dan's point is a good one. Earned communication or free media is not the only way we get information, and thank God for that, or I'd be out of a job. But paid advertising is a primary source of where you as citizens and voters receive your information, especially on down ticket situations. I mean, you think about it, do you know who your local judge is? How much thought did you put into voting for your local judge, if you voted at all? Or your local district attorney? It was probably literature that I mailed you, or the opponent mailed you, or a TV ad or a radio ad you heard. So we have other ways besides the earned media to get our message out, and oftentimes we use paid media to drive what earned media is going to say. So they really have a symbiotic relationship, and as much as sometimes we can worry about the bent, the partisan bent of an outlet, I always tell my candidates, when you have money, you're in control of telling your side of the story because I represent Republicans, and most of the time the national outlets aren't going to be on our side.
And this is a really, really interesting point, and it's one worth reflecting on before we go further into the conversation. I consider myself a well-educated voter. So after I've read the news in reputable news outlets, when I'm watching TV in the evening to relax, and the candidates put on TV commercials, I am smart enough and I'm sophisticated enough that I can dismiss what I see in those TV ads because I know better. Right, Sean? Maybe not so much.
That's not true. That's not true.
And why isn't that true?
Well, it's not true for a few reasons. Primarily through political polling, we know what you care about. And so we're talking to you not about issues that you don't care about. We're talking to you about issues that you specifically care about. And we're moving you because fundamentally you like to vote for people who talk like you, perhaps look like you, and have your shared values. And so we know through data exactly what you care about. And especially in non-national races, which is the lion's share of what we do, we're all starved for information about a candidate. And sometimes your only experience with the candidate running for California governor is the TV ads that we cut and you see in your living room, because you're never going to meet that person.
And even though I take pride in differentiating between information I get from a respected news media and from much more suspicious paid media, I think one of the things that is just a matter of human nature is when we hear information from a lot of different sources over time, we don't always remember where we heard it from first. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example. How many people in this room ever heard the story about young George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and then telling his father that he could not tell a lie? The last politician ever to be that upfront about a potential transgression, as near as I can tell. But, so we've all heard that story. How many of us remember where we heard it the first time? And by the same token, if I read about a candidate in the LA Times, and I watch a story about that candidate on Fox News, and then I go onto a more progressive website and read more, and then I see a TV ad that John Thomas has produced, all that information doesn't stay separate in my mind. It just becomes one big pile of information, and it mixes together. So lots of other things we can talk about here, but I'll tell you where I want to take the conversation is from the general to the specific. So Bill, I want to come back to you. We've talked about the changes in news media as a result of the changes in technology. Let's get specific here. Let's talk about your boss, Barack Obama. Let's talk about Donald Trump. Let's talk about how different politicians have taken advantage of these changes to reach out directly to voters.
Well, I would start with George Washington. There's a more cynical view of that story, which is that maybe he just realized that the cover-up is always worse than the crime, and so just got ahead of the news cycle.
I always thought that story was fake.
It probably is. Fake news. If you take a step back and look at how politicians have communicated with Americans in particular, there's a frustration that President Trump has right now with the news media, which is he doesn't feel like they're telling the story that he wishes that they were telling to the American people. It obviously does not start with him. Didn't start with Barack Obama, who felt the same way, nor George W. Bush or Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan. But if you go back to even FDR, who felt like he needed to get out positive messages about what was happening during the war, he began the fireside chats so that he could communicate directly with the American people and make his way around the news media and have a direct conversation with the American people. And then as the way people were receiving information changed from radio to television, you saw the national politicians who were the most successful were the ones who understood that new medium. So with television, it was JFK, who, for people who watched the debate, widely thought that he won the debate because Nixon, didn't wear makeup, looked sweaty, like I probably do right now. But people who listened to it on the radio thought Nixon won for the most part. But because it was a TV moment, JFK went on to be president of the United States. Now, Jimmy Carter was awful at the television medium. I mean, you look at his crisis of confidence speech, that was the moment that confidence was completely undercut from his presidency. But then Ronald Reagan turned that around, and his ability to communicate on television far outpaced certainly Jimmy Carter, but also Walter Mondale, and he was able to be successful. With George W. Bush, that campaign really revolutionized micro-targeting and taking messages to very specific voters and very specific channels of communication and helping to move folks in one direction or another. Now that may sound tactical, but the strategy of that was different than was available to any person before. And so when he was running against Al Gore, he did a good job in a close race of moving voters to where he needed to. Now, with President Barack Obama, one of the reasons that we were successful was because we were running against John McCain, great guy, but whose campaign, I think, wasn't quite as sophisticated in the new emerging social media that was coming about at the time. And so we really got in on Facebook and this new web service called mybarackobama.com, which gave people control over how they communicated with other voters and other people in their network. Because if you break down politics to its very first principles, the most compelling reason to an individual to vote for or against a person or a thing is what they hear from a friend or a family member. And so what mybarackobama.com did was it gave people the tools to communicate with their friends and family members on a much broader basis than they otherwise could. Now, when I was at the White House, I feel this deep guilt about this. But I know it's not my fault, but I think about it often. I had the first White House Twitter account. And it hasn't ended well with the White House, as you may or may not know. But yeah, if you look back, at Bill Burton 44 was the first account inside the White House. And I would say that we didn't fully figure out what Twitter was or how we could use it. But what Donald Trump did and on his campaign and is brought into the White House is an ability to do something that none of the broadcast networks, like John mentioned before, can do. And that is totally control the news cycle. If Donald Trump wants you to know something about what's happening in his mind or in his administration, and he takes to Twitter to let you know, what President Trump wants you to know is going to be in every newscast. It's going to be on all those many channels that we're talking about right now, because he understands how to get people's attention. And even this last week, when he decided to back the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord, the news leaked out 2 days beforehand. But he went to Twitter, and President Trump tweeted, tomorrow or in 2 days, I'll announce at 3 p.m. what I'm going to do on Paris. Even though people already knew what he was going to do, it became this event because he said it was going to be an event. And that's where we are today. I think that the next iteration of this is going to be another going back to the first principles of trying to find the most efficient way to talk to your friends and family members and whatever that broad circle of people is in terms of moving voters. But for right now, President Trump's Twitter account is the way of the world.
And you started it. Interesting.
I know. I'm not even Catholic. I'm Lutheran, but I feel Catholic guilt about the whole thing.
All right, so Ken, I'm not sure where to go with the Catholic guild conversation, so we'll put it aside for the time being and maybe come back to it. So, Ken, I'm listening to Bill here, and two things strike me. One, as John and I were talking about earlier, we take news, we take information from a lot of different sources, but not just news media and paid advertising and so on, but of course from each other. And the second thing that strikes me in listening to Bill is these historical trends. FDR and radio, Kennedy and later Reagan's use of television, Barack Obama's use of Facebook, and now Donald Trump's use of Twitter. These are continuing trends where smart, innovative people, regardless of whether you happen to agree with them politically or otherwise, use these tools in order to bypass the news media that you and Alice described in increasingly efficient ways. But it also accomplishes other things also. There's another trend going on here with each generation of technology. What's going on here?
Well, I mean, the same trends are enmeshed right into the news media, and it's kind of a best of worlds, worst of worlds. I mean, we heard about a brand new publication that pops up that can just concentrate on the anti-gun side of things, but who's behind that? I mean, these are, but from a technological standpoint, all of these tools have become democratized so much. I mean, the fact that this is going to be available live, or at least on Memorex, on a YouTube thing that can be seen throughout the world is mind-blowing. These handheld, I have a site up now. 85% of the people come to get their news on my site from a handheld like this. And it's a magic device, and also a lot of the information I get is going to be because somebody saw a plane crash and said, oh, I think I'll videotape this and put it up on Twitter. So we've seen that I think, a beautiful change from the 50s, 60s, 70s, where there was a small handful of people who were controlling that information and what you thought that I talked about earlier. And now on the opposite side of this, we see thousands and thousands of outlets. And so on one hand, there's more news, under the broadest sense of that word, than we've ever had before in our lives. On the other hand, a lot of it's just absolute garbage. And it's either sponsored, it has either has bad intentions. The whole fake news thing wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for Facebook, because there used to be fake websites up before, but nobody went to them. You pop it into Facebook, which is this whole thing. You're going past the grandkid's photo. You see this headline, oh my gosh, this happened. You retweet it out, or you re-Facebook it out and like it and get that. They could actually become profitable. Fake news for the first time, and I think it's a little overblown, but it's became profitable for the first time in our lifetime because of Facebook and one organization, because they actually could turn to make money off of that. And so what I think is this is all coming into the issue of credibility, and credibility in journalism is at an all-time low, or at least as long as we've been measuring this. And I think part of that is due to, I don't know what media I'm seeing. I don't know if this is fake. Is this an opinion piece? Dan, you were talking this afternoon at lunch about how sometimes you're on your thing, you're halfway down a piece before you realize this isn't a news piece. This is a columnist with a point of view piece, and now I know this. So we're at a very weird thing where we've got more information than we've ever had, and not great ways to disseminate and have trustworthy people to say, this is good and this isn't, or I could follow this person's lead on how to do this. And when you combine that kind of with an ever-polarized electorate and an ever-polarized news media, where I think half the people in America think that CNN is actively working against the President of the United States. And I'm one of those people. I completely believe that. I don't believe that they lie. I don't believe that they make things up, but I look at the front page and it looks like a partisan document to me. So we have those two elements going on, and it's like wrestling under the rug.
Thanks. I actually think you hit on something, and I work at CNN, and I'm a Republican. and I support the president. I'm one of the few. But
You're a token.
yeah, I'm the token. That's what they call me. But my friends at CNN who work there ask me all the time, John, do you really believe we're fake news? And Ken, I think you hit it on the head. I always tell them, I don't think you report mistruths. You don't lie. But the fake news to me is the editorial selections. It said of all the things you could talk about today, the fact that unemployment is the lowest it has been in 16 years. You're going to talk about the book that the Pope gave to Trump about climate change, and whether or not he'll read it because he's not a big reader, right? It's those kind of editorial selections that create the perception of bias that create the fake news. I think that's kind of an important thing because I don't think Ken or I are going to say that these major outlets are lying about the facts. It's just editorial selections.
Okay.
Can I add something to that?
Just before you do, Alice, I'm looking at Naomi, and I've decided that I really want to play poker with her at some point because I'm going to gather as a career-long respected progressive communicator that you've come to a slightly different conclusion than John and Ken may have on these topics. So by all means, if you'd be willing to weigh in.
John and Ken KFI, it defines me. Yeah, I mean, that only the sort of major outlets are curating their news seems to be its own fake news. That's actually not the case, right? We have, Fox is certainly curating its news. Everyone is curating their
Everybody
news,
picks
and-
their own news.
And so I think sort of saying that, one side is doing it more than the other, and also it's a false equivalency. If somehow it's like CNN, who is employing you, by the way, so they have to have some other point of view, right?
I'm about one of four.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So you're there.
Out of 50 commentators on board.
I mean, I'd like to know the Fox numbers.
No, and both
Do you
sides
know what I mean?
are
I think
guilty
so.
of it.
I think it's just understanding that and getting a fuller picture. So we have, we need to figure out. Like I helped found and launch Media Matters for America, which in 2004 corrects conservative misinformation in the media, and we were really, really busy. And we really busy.
They would send out 10 press releases a day about Fox. It was
deservedly so.
Maybe.
And so.
But I don't. So.
So, and so one of the things that was really interesting is that I spent a lot of my time watching, Sinclair Broadcasting and the way they tried to swift vote John Kerry. I spent a lot of time watching Republicans do a lot of their analysis and then doing analysis on their analysis if it doesn't get too meta, and understanding how do we get to your fair and balanced place? How do we take the information that is being fed out with Hugh Hewitt? How do we get the information that's getting fed out on the right and just actually get to the facts, right? So it's like we're calling out some of that and finding out sort of how do we get through there. So I'm not saying that there's not some level of bias on both sides, right? But saying that CNN as a side, I think that's where it comes down and it becomes a little problematic.
So Alice, I'm going to ask for a little bit of help here.
Yeah. Because I'm not a
Na-
Republican or a Democrat,
No, I know,
so
you-
I'm right in the middle there.
Perfect, and that's why we
You're
had
the
you sit-
honest one.
That's why we had you sit there. We were going to give her a striped shirt and a whistle, and we just didn't have time to get to the sporting goods store. So Naomi just now and Bill a little bit earlier talked about excesses among conservative media.
Yeah.
Ken and John, not too long ago, talked about excesses among other media sources. Can you help us make some sense of this?
Yes, I hope so. So I really like one of the things that John said, where he said, with CNN, it's not that they're reporting mistruths or things that are false. It's the story selection. It's deciding what has priority, and that's always been true, right? So if you look at really classic front pages, whether it's from D-Day or Watergate or really big moments, you'll see they have big headlines, big pictures. They take up most of the front page, and those are visual cues to the reader that, hey, this story is really important. And that's true even now, whether the mayor makes the front page of the LA Times on a certain day, it's going to be because the editors felt that story was more important than 10 other stories, and it was so important it couldn't go on the inside of the paper. And so that is always there. It's even true just in our word usage. If you call somebody for a comment on a story and they don't want to talk to you, do you say they declined to comment? Or do you say they refused to comment? Because those are different tones. Those words might convey the same outcome. They didn't talk to you. But they have different tones. And so are you almost putting in bias in your story because you say they refused to talk to you? And so I think kind of what John's getting at with CNN, I mean, I probably watch more cable news now, kind of in the Trump era. CNN is picking what they think people want to watch. They wouldn't talk endlessly about the same topic late into the night if people weren't watching it. And that's probably different than what the Fox viewer is looking at. It's always been there, I guess, in the story selection and how people sort of view what is important. And I think what's sort of happening now is because there's this proliferation of so many other outlets that, when you only had your big city newspaper and 3 TV stations, you didn't really know there were other stories out there that you might care about, right? Like your knowledge and your universe of what news was out there was so much smaller. But now if I have 5 blogs that I look at every day and I listen to a podcast and I look at Twitter, well, now I know that maybe there's 5 good stories that the LA Times didn't cover today. And if I see that enough, am I going to start to question that the LA Times is biased because they're not covering these other stories that I know are out there? I mean, that's sort of, I think, a philosophical question for journalists, but I sort of think that might be part of what we're seeing, that people just have so many more choices now so that when their story is not being covered, is that bias, or did you just not have reporters today to go cover that?
So I want to take, I have a follow-up question that I'll put to the entire panel in just a moment, but 2 quick things first. One, on the off chance that this conversation we've been having for the last several minutes about media bias is something any of you would like to weigh in on, once again, now's a good time to remind you that you have cards and writing instruments with which to write questions. And you can direct those questions either to a specific panelist or panelists or to any of them. And so we'll be collecting those cards in about 10 minutes or so. And if this is something you want to hear a little bit more on, we'll of course make sure, as I said earlier, to get as many of those questions as possible. Quick moderator's prerogative though for a moment before we go back to the panel. And this is something that a small number of us talked about at dinner last night. The phenomenon that Alice just mentioned has another name. I'll call it human nature. And human nature suggests that all of us want to talk to and listen to and read the smartest people in the world. Who are the smartest people in the world? Why, they're the people who agree with me. And some of us find the smartest people of the world on Fox News. Others find those people on MSNBC. But it's simply human nature to want to be reminded why you're right about things because you're smart, rather than being challenged that you might be wrong. And one of the things hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about before we conclude today's program is the importance and the responsibility that each of us has as citizens to resist that human nature and to make an active effort to reach out and read or listen to or watch information and opinion from news sources that might not fit those with which you agree. And the one thing, it might be the only thing, but the one thing that Bill and Ken and Naomi and John can all agree on is the importance of making yourself available to those opinions and those information sources that don't necessarily reflect and reinforce what you already believe. So here's what I want to ask the panel now before we get to the audience questions. One of the things that we've established in our previous programs here, as most of you know, is that American society, the American electorate, has become much more partisan and much more polarized than ever before. As we've hinted at over the last several minutes of conversations, the news media, because of advances in technology, has now taken on similar characteristics. My question for any and all of our panelists is, which one causes the other? In other words, are we now more partisan as a society because the news media drives us in that direction? Or is the news media more partisan and more likely to cater to a particular ideological vantage point in order to serve the marketplace? In other words, has the media become more partisan as a response to us as a society? Which one caused the other? How'd this happen?
I'll take the first crack.
John?
I think people have become more partisan, and the media is a reflection of it. And I'll give you an example. In political campaigns, my job is never to educate you. My job is to meet you where you're at today and what you think today and tell you we agree. And so we spend a lot of time in our advertising not trying to persuade you on move your thoughts, but yet helping you understand that where you're at today is where this public policy issue or this candidate is. I think it's the same thing with media, is they have to sell newspapers, they have to sell clicks, and just like Dan said, we want people that agree with us now more than ever, and I think the media is just a reflection of that, and it's easier because there's so many different channels to find. Like, I can be profitable with a podcast with 50,000 people listening, which is easy to do. I can be so I don't need to. If I just have a niche, I can still make a business on that. Whereas it was harder to do that because the startup costs are so much larger in the past to sell newspapers.
So really, really interesting, and it goes back to a point, if you remember, that Bill made toward the beginning of this program, that of course most news media organizations, in addition to having the responsibility of informing us, are businesses. And not only to make money, but in order to survive and continue to hire reporters and producers and editors, they need as many readers or as many viewers or as many listeners as possible. And what we've just heard John say, one opinion, and we'll see if there are others from the rest of the panel, is that because one of a media organization's primary goals is to attract as large an audience as possible, that reaching out to a particular ideological subset over the overall electorate is simply good business. Other thoughts from the panelists on this question?
Well, let's not overdo what we've got going. We've been through a civil war that killed almost 1 million Americans. You know, when I was 3 years old, we had a lot of riots going on in a lot of places. So society's been a little imperfect before in America before. So I'm not quite sure whether we're at the worst point that we've ever been. And I think, of course, the answer is yes to both of those things. I think that certainly we have become a little bit more polarized, but I do think the self-selection of being able to find your own media, find your world, is going to make people a little bit more entrenched in that. I still think it's better than the alternative. I still think it's better than having some forces that you don't know, that you never saw. I'm starting to sound like Spiro Agnew, because he was talking, and that was exactly the point he made, is he said there's a handful of people who control what you think. To me, that's more troublesome than us yelling at each other.
Please.
I think my mic's on.
Just shout.
Okay. But I think Ken makes a good point. Other than, is this on? Yeah. Is this on?
Yeah.
They're both on. I think Ken makes a good point. Other than some truisms in journalism, like if it bleeds, it leads, right? In the past, before the internet, journalists and copy editors and newspaper owners didn't necessarily know what story was the most popular. They didn't really know. And so you got a broader mix in newspapers of longer pieces, of a wider range of topics, where now folks like Ken know exactly what's selling. And so
By the second.
It's
By the
amazing.
minute.
And so, folks like Ken are in the job in the business of not completely just selling clicks, but you have to sell clicks. And a program director I do work at KFI as well, with John and Ken. The program director over there told me something I thought was very true. She said, I said, how do you select which stories you guys are going to cover on the radio station? And she said, first of all, we know with pinpoint accuracy because of streaming and whatnot when people are tuning in and out. She said, I would love to educate the public in depth and feed them broccoli all day. But people don't want broccoli. They want brownies. So I'm going to give them brownies and I'm going to sprinkle in broccoli. And that's kind of where we've got, because brownies sell, broccoli doesn't.
Okay, I'm a little bit troubled with the imagery of brownies sprinkled with broccoli, so I'll assume you're talking figuratively so I can eat dinner tonight. Bill, let me let me ask you the question in a different way. Ken talked a couple of minutes ago about this marketplace of media, if you will, and a competing number of voices. And Ken and his former colleagues would tell you that that has allowed a conservative viewpoint to be heard in a way in which it was not before these developments took place. As a media spokesperson, as a communication strategist for candidate and President Obama, is your job easier or harder? Was your job easier or harder because of this much larger number of media outlets? Is it good or is it bad for you?
Well, I think ultimately Ken is right, that this is not necessarily the worst moment in American history. And I make that point because, President Obama, Senator Obama, all the different presidents going all the way back to, the things that Thomas Jefferson was accused of in the press. Everybody's had to deal with an aggressive press that was trying to, either sell newspapers or make a political point or, upend a presidency. That has happened throughout time. And I think that our iteration of it when I worked for President Obama, our job was made difficult, but that job has always been difficult. Certainly Fox News promoting stories about, whether or not President Obama, then Senator Obama, was educated at a madrasa in Indonesia, questioning where he was born, pushing and prodding on different ties that he had, no matter how specious. Yes, that took up time in my day, and it was particularly annoying, especially when there were people just flat out lying on television. But at the same time, I don't think that was special to President Obama. I think that it's part of what presidential politics is you have to sort through a lot of different people saying a lot of different things. And through that process, you get to a place where people try to get a measure of the human being who's trying to be president and make their choice. And some of that is, batting off lies.
And so if I take that response plus something you said earlier and I combine them, what I gather is this, is that for a political leader, a candidate, or an elected official, on one hand, this more populated media environment creates a lot of challenges and a lot of annoyances, but it also creates opportunities for you to communicate with voters in a way that might not have otherwise been the case before. So good and bad, huh?
That's right, yeah. I would say it's a mix of both. I think that more information is generally better. When that information is not good information, it's obviously a challenge, but something that we've been dealing with since the beginning of our country.
Okay. Naomi, let me ask you this question, because we've been talking primarily up until now about candidates, about elections, about me trying to attract votes for a man or woman so he or she can take office. Let's move from before the election till after the election, when the challenge isn't for a politician to get votes, but for an office holder to build support for his or her policy agenda, to convince different people in the community with different priorities and different leanings that they do need to work together toward a common set of goals. You're in charge of communications for the mayor of one of the largest cities on the planet. Talk about how these tools that we've been talking about make your job in that context easier or harder.
I mean, I don't know if it's easier or harder. It's certainly more interesting. We now can do, we can engage, we can educate, and we can also entertain. All of our social media platforms combined speak to more people every day than all of the TV news stations, every single newscast combined on any given day. So we have this enormous audience. So we're really our own news outlet in some ways. So it allows us not only to tell you what's going on in the city, but it also allows us to engage with residents. So when we're talking about things like homelessness, where folks are seeing encampments on the streets everywhere throughout the city and thinking, what can we do? We start something called the Welcome Home Project. And we get that out on all of our channels where people can then have welcome home sort of parties, and we put together baskets and bring those baskets over to fire stations and deliver those to affordable housing units and permanent supportive housing, and allow us to really be a part of the solution. And so that's a very, I think, exciting, engaging piece of it. We also are working with other kinds of platforms. So with Facebook, it's not just what we're putting out there. We're working with Facebook that if there is a disaster in Los Angeles, they're going to go out and they're going to try to figure out who's safe, who's not safe, and really work with the city to figure out and identify what needs to be done. They're using targeting for good, right? They're targeting folks that need to get help, that need to get that message to figure out how to stay safe. So we also have these amazing other kinds of opportunities. For example, when we had construction on the 101, we put together a video called the 101 Slow Jam. It became this massive viral hit. It was the mayor doing sort of a jam with one of the high school jazz bands. And it was ubiquitous. And what was amazing is kind of everyone knew about the 101 Slow Jam. So we're able to both entertain and educate and engage. So it's a huge, I think, responsibility every day because we are tweeting and we have to probably think harder than some other tweeters out there. We can't just sort of vomit all over everyone, everything that we're thinking. And so we have to be, we will dance instead, that's right. Strategically dance.
That gets back to the broccoli and brownie thing.
Exactly, we do it both. So I think that, so for us, being able to do all of those things is a very, very, very exciting moment.
Well, and this is something that I find fascinating and don't know quite how to get my head around. On one hand, Walter Cronkite would have never put a 101 highway slow jam on the news. And there's something good about that. On the other hand, because there's such a larger range of options, the mayor of Los Angeles was not able to inform the people of his city about a major change in traffic patterns, but was able to do it in a more entertaining way. So once again, going back to the point that Bill made a moment ago, maybe not necessarily good, maybe not necessarily bad, but certainly different, and Alice, certainly more challenging for the news consumer. It was relatively easy for me back in the day to decide whether to watch NBC, CBS, or ABC at 6:30. I had a newspaper show up on my doorstep in the morning, and just to give my age away, I had a second newspaper show up on my doorstep in the afternoon, if you remember that. That was pretty straightforward. They decided for me, someone decided for me what news was, not for the news media, not for the newsmaker, but for the news consumer, for the citizenry. This is a pretty complicated environment to navigate, isn't it?
Yes, it's very complicated. And I was just sort of thinking about, you were talking about the mayor's Twitter and social media platform. When I hear that, to me, one of the concerns as a former journalist is I think people forget that when you are reading the Twitter account of a politician or a city, whether it's the mayor or Trump, you are getting that person's perspective, right? Which is going to be not objective. And that's not a good or a bad, but it's not objective. And I think the audience forgets that because, as Dan made the point, we don't always remember where we're getting information from. I might not remember that I saw it on someone's Twitter feed or if I saw it in the LA Times. I just know I got a snippet of information. And I think one of the challenges for journalists is to show their value when people think, well, I could just look at Facebook or I could just watch a video from a guy at a protest, and isn't that sort of the same? There's a group, the Society of Professional Journalists. It's the largest organization in the country representing reporters. It advocates on their behalf. It advocates for open records laws if reporters are faced with jail time, and it advocates for ethical journalism, which is a thing. There are ethics in journalism. There's a whole code, and it says seek truth and report it, minimize harm, so to think about the people who will be impacted by the news that you have. And to be transparent, to avoid even the appearance of conflicts of interest, to tell people where you're getting your information from, to tell them how you put together a story. And those start to be the building blocks of good information, good journalism that people can then absorb and make either a political decision if they're going to vote for a candidate or if they're going to take action in their city. But I don't think journalists have ever done a great job of explaining that that's part of their value. There is value in being a gatekeeper, even though that word makes it sound like we're keeping information from you, which can happen when you only have three white men in New York telling you the news. And so I think that's been a huge challenge for journalists, and it's a challenge for the news consumer, because I'm gonna guess that this 2-hour discussion is probably more time that people typically spend thinking about the news, right? You wake up in the morning, you look at your phone, you read the newspaper. You shouldn't have to think about what bias is in here, where is this news coming from, can I really trust it? But that is sort of the point that we're at, and I think it's a very difficult time to be a news consumer, even though it's wonderful that we have so many options and other outlets, and we're hearing stories that maybe traditionally we would not have heard.
Well, we have a record number of questions from the audience. I have to say, every time we've come to join you, the number of questions, and there are even more, it appears. If we were going to read all of these questions, we would be serving breakfast, the brownies and broccoli recipe that John mentioned earlier in all likelihood. So I'm going to do my best to ask as many as possible, but we've got some fascinating questions here, and I'm eager to hear the panelists' thought. First of all, our high school students, as has been the case every time we've done one of these programs, have come up with particularly intelligent, particularly insightful questions, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. So we're going to start out with a question from Elizabeth Spiller from Villanova Prep. Elizabeth asks, and it's a pretty straightforward question, guys. If your goal is to become a more educated citizen, is it more important to be using online social media or more traditional print and TV outlets? Which of those types of news sources will make you a more educated, more informed citizen?
May I take this just quickly?
Of course.
I would say all of the above. And I'll use today as an example. We all just went through this. Many of you probably noticed that there was an incident in London. When that happened, we had just broken from lunch. I had CNN on in my hotel room. And that was interesting, but there was still a lot of information coming in. I wasn't informed. We didn't know what we didn't know. So I quickly opened up my phone. I went to New York Times. Then I went to Drudge. Then I said, you know what, that seems stale because this is an ever-evolving situation. Then I flip on Twitter and I check out the hashtag London Bridge. And I'm watching as things coming in, understanding that I have to take certain things with grains of salt, but there's live video feed of people that are there. And so that's what you have to do. It's more work than it was. But if you really want to be informed, whether it's a live incident or something else, I mean, I think all of us at this table, we don't go to one news source. You know, we look at a host, and oftentimes we look at sources that we know we'll disagree with because we think it's important to understand the other side.
I think that if your goal is to be as up to date as humanly possible, like on the London situation, then that's certainly right. But I think that if the goal is to have like a deeper breadth of knowledge of what's happening in the world, even if you just pick one newspaper that you're reading front to back every day, you're going to be better off in general because you'll have added so much to your depth of knowledge on any particular set of issues. So I think that like staying really on top of things and having a diversity of news outlets that you go to throughout the course of a day is good, but actually reading long articles and digging in on long form pieces on television or radio offers you some perspective that I think is critical that not enough people are engaging on.
And I think, Elizabeth, it's a great question, and I'll take Bill's point and just take it a step further, is social media can give you immediacy, traditional news media can give you context. And I think what we'll hear from the rest of our panel over the course of this discussion, as John and Bill both suggested, is the importance of relying not on any one source of information, but rather a range of them, not just ideologically, but in terms of the type of media platform also. Very interesting question here for anyone who'd like to take it. And that's a question not about traditional news media, not about paid advertising, but about political-based entertainment. We talked about how political information comes from such a range of sources, and of course, as most of you know, that's nothing new either. You know, Chevy Chase pioneered this on Saturday Night Live 40 years ago, and before that, Rowan and Martin did it on Laugh-In, and before that, Mark Twain and Will Rogers engaged in political satire. But in this environment, Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live, Seth Meyers, Colbert, how much of an impact does that type of discussion have on the overall political discourse? Anyone who'd like to take a shot? Alice, you look poised.
Well, I think in some ways those shows, and I'm thinking about, for example, like the Samantha Bee show on TBS and John Oliver, I actually think they have less of an impact because what's happening in Washington is already so over the top in terms of the tweets that we see from the president, some of what, what Kellyanne Conway says. I mean, you couldn't script some of the things that she says. And so I will watch the Samantha Bee show because I like her, and it's just kind of not that entertaining to me anymore because reality has so far outpaced it. I think that the SNL stuff, that seems to be a moment for people. Like, people seem to be talking about it on Monday, and I think that's good. Because there's so few places where everybody seems to gather now. I mean, maybe it's watching the Super Bowl, but beyond that, I don't know, like, any one event everybody sort of participates in. So if it's going to be something like that, I think that's fine. But I actually think in some ways, just for me personally, these shows are much less entertaining because by the end of the day, I just need a break because things are already just so crazy. It's hard to joke about it at 10 o'clock at night.
Generally, and there's actually been studies on this that have found that this type of political-based entertainment tends to reinforce existing opinions rather than change them, which of course is a very valuable role in a political discussion, but it is a more specific one. Ken, this is moderator's prerogative. I don't think I have a question in the pile on this. Samantha Bee, Stephen Colbert, Bill Maher, Saturday Night Live. Why aren't there conservative, funny people on television?
That's an important question. I don't know. I think because the fundamental of humor is you have to lie, and conservatives like telling the truth a little bit more. I don't know is the short answer. We had a question earlier. Why is whatever percentage of the media is voted against Donald Trump is somewhere between 75 and 95, if I had to guess. Those are macro kind of social issues. I would say that there are some comedians that are on the right, not a whole lot, but you're going to see them more likely on YouTube than you're going to see them on CBS. I think that the same forces that controlled Channel 2, Channel 4, Channel 7 are primarily the ones that still, look, Hollywood is not a conservative-oriented place. The entertainment industry, by and large, does not pull from people who are kind of right of center on that. So I think it's an extension of that, probably more so than the truth-telling.
I don't know. We're in this moment where anybody can be famous, right? Like, you can get on YouTube and if you're funny or you're talented, you rise to the top. There is a weird thing that there's no funny conservatives out there. I'm of the view that
there are some online, but not in the big world.
Not that have mass appeal. And I'm of the opinion that it doesn't actually matter necessarily because when you turn on Stephen Colbert, it's the same as turning on MSNBC, and same with Saturday Night Live. The left is doing the left, and I find it hilarious, and so do other people on the left, and which is why the shows are successful. But it's just weird. I don't know.
I think there are two elements at play. First, those primetime shows are chasing the key demo, which skews younger. So advertisers want to buy a younger audience. Younger people tend to be more liberal and naive, but liberal. So pandering to that audience is going to sell ratings. But I think Ken's point also is Hollywood just tends to be more liberal, and those are the people who get selected to do the shows, and that's how it's evolved.
Okay, I'm going to take this conversation in a different direction, although that one was a lot of fun, I have to admit. Naomi, I'm going to come to you first with this one, and of course anyone else can weigh in as well. Really smart, thoughtful question here about social media. We talked earlier about how social media allows a newsmaker, a candidate, an office holder, to target their message more specifically to different components of the electorate, much more specifically than a television story or a newspaper story can. The question, Naomi, then, is does social media drive us in different directions? In other words, can it be a unifying force, or because different people are hearing different messages, does that contribute to our polarization?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I think it allows us, again, it's another tool in the toolbox for folks to be able to communicate with one another. So I don't think having another communications tool is bad, or that it somehow polarizes us in and of itself. There certainly are polarizing forces within any given, Twitter feed, with any given Facebook feed. But we do sort of, again, curate those so that they are more of what we're looking to see and what we're looking to read. But I don't think the tools themselves are polarizing. I don't think that necessarily our use of them is. But I do think the fact that we curate them so that we're only reading from our own echo chamber can be.
Okay. So in other words, the technology may allow us to isolate ourselves, but it's incumbent upon us to not let that happen.
That's it.
Okay. Bill, taking the conversation in yet another completely different direction. This is specifically directed toward you, although others can weigh in, of course, as well. Bill, what is your take on Sean Spicer? Will he explode?
So, I can't speak to whether or not he will explode. Just going to take that up with God. When I was at the White House, my job was to help the press secretary get ready for briefings, and when he didn't brief, I would brief from the podium. And when the president traveled, we'd go around the country, and this is the only thing that I miss about my old job and about being in Washington. When we left the South Lawn, we'd get in the helicopter, I'd sit next to the president, and I would ask him about what was in the news so that it would help inform how I briefed the press corps on Air Force One or at a briefing wherever we were going. And I was so lucky that I had a boss that didn't like to travel, because it meant that I was on that helicopter every week. And the first time I briefed the press corps, you're given all sorts of guidance from different parts of the executive branch, right? The national security folks have some things that they want to make sure that you say, messages that they want to send. The domestic policy council has things they want to say, the economic council. And you try to take it all in, and then you're translating it to reporters who are asking questions in the wrong way, and you're trying to get your messages out. Anyway, the national security stuff is particularly important, because you are given specific messages that you are trying to get to Beijing or Moscow or Paris or wherever it is. And so you've got to get that exactly right. And I remember the first time that I briefed on Air Force One, when we landed, somebody, the press assistant gave me a stack of the clips that were generated from the briefing. I remember the first one that I read, it was this Reuters story, and the headline was, U.S. warns China on currency. And I was like, so when they say U.S., they mean Bill Burton from Buffalo, New York, warned China. But it was this moment where I always knew that the words that I said were important, but when you take on the notion that you are speaking not just for the president, but for the United States of America, it means something. And so when Sean Spicer comes out and just lies, he's not just doing that on behalf of President Trump. He's doing it on behalf of all of you, all of us, the whole country. And it's embarrassing. And he should be fired. And he should not have gotten that job. And, I think that you have to take the words from that podium with the height of seriousness, and I don't think that he does.
No, I don't want to defend that.
Okay. Okay, Ken, I have a question that I think is particularly well suited to you. And this is from Ira Posser from San Clemente High School. Really good question I have, Ira. Nicely done. Ira wants to know, why don't TV shows have 1 hour in-depth discussions with true experts, like 2 pro-global warming scientists and 2 scientists who think otherwise?
Yeah, I think that's it's a great idea, and it probably does happen in certain areas, but it goes back to the broccoli and the broccoli and the brownies. There are things. Look, this panel up here, I think, is fantastic. I would assume that we will get so many page views and views of this than the mayor dancing about the 101 or some other condensed version. Most people don't want to spend an hour learning about things like that. I wish they would, and I'm glad that we have a way that people can do all of it. But, you know, when was the last time you sat down for an hour discussion on global warming? It's a niche audience. It's important, but it's not popular.
And also the truth is, it is available if people want that, right? You
A
can
lot
get
of that's
online and
available.
you
You
can
can get a lot of
you
good
can
information
engage,
like that, right?
you know, with Yale professors or anybody you want to and get it. But it's the marketplace taking care of what people want to get information about.
Right. I mean, PBS exists,
Right.
just not many people watch it.
A lot of people in here though, I bet.
Well, no, but that wasn't a qualitative statement. That was a statement of fact.
It's true.
And similarly, you know, it's the C-SPAN is a terrific example of you have a debate and you can, and the camera on C-SPAN will watch, let's say the House debate something, and its numbers are fractional compared to what the number of people who will watch the analysis of that on CNN or a Fox. Now, partially that's because you watch some of that, you actually want what one of you two were talking about the context of, you want somebody kind of intelligent who's watched if you watch a House chamber, you'll sit in there, or at least I'll sit there and not understand most of what's going on. The people who understand that process and can boil it down and explain it is of value. But these things exist, they're just not quite as popular as the fluff.
I actually worked at C-SPAN, not for long, but I worked there, and my favorite story is I came on, you know, as one of the lead communication folks, and I just come from the Hill, and I write my very first press release, and I give it to my boss, and it comes back to me, and there's red all over it, and they've crossed out everything. And I was like, what's the issue? The adjectives. No adjectives, please. The adjectives are the issue. And I'm like, but I am an adjective. What do you mean? And I said, we don't do adjectives here. We just state the facts. And what was so interesting is that C-SPAN doesn't care about ratings until it does. You know, I would work there and help some of the producers. And they did care that they got some interesting folks on. They did care that they got some interesting 3 a.m. drunken questions. They did care about those things. But all they really wanted to do was inform. They literally had one mission, and they repeat that again and again and again as I tried to gin up interest. They were only so interested in interest.
Alice, I have a question for you. What is fake news?
Well, it's not news that you don't like or news that you disagree with. I mean, there is real fake news, but the term has just been totally exploited by every politician, quite effectively, I will say. There are, I think, a couple of things that you can look at to figure out if something is fake news. These are not absolutes, but they will give you guidance, because real news will quote people in their stories. They will tell you who they're speaking to, and that person will be an expert, a newsmaker, an eyewitness to something. Real news will reference reports and documents, and they will tell you where those reports and documents are from. Real news will spell words correctly and use proper grammar, and use the AP style guide to tell them how to refer to things. Real news will usually have a byline on it, almost always have a byline. Real news will come from a site that has an About Us page that probably tells you that they are a real news source. And I think most importantly, when a reporter gets something wrong, which can happen even with the best of intentions, they will run a correction. Fake news is never going to run a correction because they would have to correct the whole thing. It's fake. So I would say if you are trying to figure out if a story is real or fake, those would be where I would start. Start looking at those signs, and it should help you to figure out if this is a legitimate source that has credibility or if it's something else.
John?
I have a quick question for you, Alice. Those were sage points.
Uh-oh.
But in the last several months, particularly pertaining to Russia and Comey, the word anonymous is everywhere. And that violates one of your rules. An anonymous source says. An anonymous source, without any hard documents.
Yeah.
So are we to trust the outlet and the journalist that quotes an anonymous source? I mean, how do we sort that out?
So I think it's very difficult, and I do think that newspapers have gotten really sloppy about it. There's actually been academic articles about the New York Times use of anonymous sourcing, particularly when it comes from the White House or the executive branch. I think you should only use an anonymous source if there has to be a compelling reason. And I think on a lot of these Russian stories, there's not a compelling reason. I think it often gives people cover when they don't want to put their name next to something. And that's not a good reason to use an anonymous source. I think it's very difficult for the public to figure out when they should believe it. I think if there are first of all, you should always read the byline of a story that you're reading. Figure out which reporters in general you like and that you trust. And if those reporters start using anonymous sources, hopefully they've built up enough credibility with you that you feel like they're not going to mislead you. But I have to say, I think the use of anonymous sources has gotten out of control. I think it's very difficult for the news consumer to figure out what's accurate. I do find it hilarious when this administration says that if someone doesn't put a name on it, you can't trust it and don't trust anonymous sources when they themselves are often the anonymous source in a story. But I think it's very difficult.
Ken, I'll come to you in just 1 second, Bill, but I want to ask Ken to follow up on this. Because clearly, in your role as a bureau chief, as an executive making these kind of editorial decisions, how did you decide when it was appropriate and when it was not appropriate to use information from a source that did not want to be publicly identified?
Sure. The one core point of what you said I think is really important. If I trust you and you say, look, a friend told me this, so trust me, I'll trust you. But if I walk into this and think you're a partisan or you're doing these things, and I do think that the use of anonymous sources and people's awareness and trouble with the anonymous sources coincides with the falling trust in the American media. Because if I don't trust you when you say, hey, somebody told me this on the slide, it's going to be yeah. And that's why I think a good chunk of America now sees a good chunk of stories coming out of Washington, D.C. and says, yeah, I've seen it. But some of the most important stories in the world are broken by people who don't want to get fired or run out of town or thrown in jail or killed. I mean, it's a serious thing. And so while you've got kind of the Trump and some of the conservatives saying, well, you should just never use that again, that's just not an acceptable answer. So the first thing is I have to trust my reporter. Now, hopefully that person wouldn't work for me if I didn't trust him or her. But if it was a brand new person who was saying, I've got sources and it doesn't sound right, that's tough. Usually you will go for an anonymous source if it was somebody who was close to the action and you kind of can verify that. But you don't take it usually willy-nilly. It's not like, hey, somebody called me on the phone. Usually this is somebody who, sometimes it's the very obvious. I mean, literally you could be talking with a senator on the plane and he'll be like, you can say this, but just say it's an anonymous source. Okay, I trust that source, or at least I trust who it's coming from, and I can evaluate that as a journalist. But you will try to put as many of your other investigative skills into action there. Does this person seem to be making sense? Does this person seem to be close to the action that he or she is describing? What are somebody's motivations? We all have motivations to say things. We all have motivations to lie. A lot of people are motivated. They come and say there's this skullduggery going on in my department is because they've had a moral conscience and they've seen bad things happening and want to tell that story. Watergate's a terrific example of the people who were working in the committee to re-elect the president, seeing cash go out, seeing Watergate burglars getting dough, and their conscience got to them. That's not always the case. A lot of times just because I want to screw the guy in the office next to me. And I know something that Bill said or did, and blah, 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 so I'm going to go tell. And then you have to put all of that into your thinking on it. So all of those kind of investigative things that you can do before you're willing to say an administration official said X. I don't suspect that all journalists are doing that, but that's what they should be.
Thank you. Bill, I know you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore what Alice said, but in a more partisan way. I think that one of the a key strategy of President Trump is to delegitimize the news media, and he's doing it in a way that other presidents haven't done before. Other presidents have certainly complained about the media, but not in the same way that President Trump has gone out and called legitimate news organizations fake news over and over again, suggesting storylines are fake news, oftentimes when they're completely credible and totally true, but he's employing a tactic to try to undermine any credibility in news organizations that are reporting on things that he wished that they wouldn't report on. That's a different thing that we've never seen in any administration before, and it's, to borrow a term, deplorable.
John, do you agree?
Well, I would have argued that other Republicans should have pushed back on the media more. Democrats have gotten a pass, largely, not to say that the media didn't stick it to you at times, because they did. The Fox News channel did, but they were one channel. I don't blame President Trump for branding the fake news, and by and large, because he has to reinforce it to his base. They want to hear that, and they like it when he says that.
Right. See, this is my problem: is that it's not saying that the news is incredible. It's a tactic to talk to his base. That's what's so awful about this moment with the presidency and the media. It's that there's a tactic being employed for political reasons, not just because you actually think the news is incredible. It's because you need to get your base fired up and behind you.
That's the point that I disagree with.
Yeah.
I actually believe that they believe it is not credible. But let me tell you what that term means. Again, it's not, I don't believe that CNN makes up things. But I can tell you, if I didn't like the Chautauqua, I could go and I could interview a few people. I could cherry pick. You guys booed me once when I made a Republican joke. I could talk about the boos and the hisses. I could find, now after we talk, we'll come down here and we'll chat with you guys, and somebody will be a little overly partisan. I could cherry pick truth to present a completely flipped and completely fake scenario. And I believe that the president's people, I don't know what he thinks, but I believe that they believe that they're not just doing this as a tactic that they don't believe in to get up a base, as much as I believe that they actually believe that the press goes through that, is cherry picking those things and creating what they consider a fake version of reality, even though it's said with all factual truths. So I don't disagree that he's done that. I just, the underlying reason I think is a little bit perhaps different.
We'll just have to agree to disagree.
So I have another question here as it relates not to President Trump, but to candidate Trump. I'd love to hear some thoughts on the panel on this. And there's several questions along these lines, so I'm going to do my best to paraphrase them. We talked earlier, Bill made the point originally, and others have talked to it, about how part of the news media, most news organizations' goal is not just to inform, but to attract as large an audience as possible. There have been studies done that showed that candidate Trump received a much, much larger amount of news coverage, particularly cable news coverage, over the course of his campaign than the other candidates did. And there are those who argue that imbalance was of great benefit to his campaign. So John, I'll start with you. Did CNN elect Donald Trump president?
No.
Okay, thank you.
No, they didn't. No. Trump understood something fundamentally about the news media, that if it bleeds, it leads. If you pick fights, if you say salacious things, he knew how to manipulate the media in a way that they were forced to cover him, because again, they have to sell newspapers, and they knew people could work. This insatiable desire to hear about what he's saying, and so he manipulated them. But of course, they could have shut off the cameras, but then they'd be shutting down their ratings.
Naomi, your thoughts on this?
I'm not going to jump in about Trump.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna ask a much broader question, which as we head into our last 10, 15 minutes or so, I think can help frame the way we wind this up by reminding all of ourselves that the media, as I said earlier, does not exist as an entity unto itself, but is a component of a larger society. So I'm gonna start out with this, and I'm gonna ask all 5 panelists to answer it. What are your preferred news sources? What do you rely on for news, information, and opinion? Where do you go?
Fox.
Yes. Liar.
No, I actually do. Because I want to see how Fox is telling a story. And I think that actually matters. But I think I look across the board. You know, I had the luxury this morning of actually going through a printed New York Times and seeing, you know, how the Supreme Court is going to deal with the Muslim ban. And walking through that, it was fascinating to actually have the time to drill down, go through the Q&A. It was super well done. And then I'm able to go and see like what folks are saying about that and what they're saying about that actual story. But I mean, I go through and I look through everything from millennial targeted publications like a Vox or like an Aussie, and then I'm also looking at some of the very older publications that I know I trust, and I take all of those together and figure out what exactly I feel like the story is and how I can create some analysis and contextualize something about what they're trying to tell me.
So before we go on to the next panelist, I'll just say that before Naomi offered us, I think, a very, very smart overview of the importance of perspective and context, not so much in news media coverage, but in the way we as citizens intake the news. The first thing that my very, very fiercely progressive friend Naomi did was say that she watches Fox. And she wasn't saying it to be ironic or wasn't saying it to be funny. She was talking about it in the context of being an informed and an educated citizen. Who else wants to weigh in on this one? What do you watch? What do you listen to? What do you read?
I'm sorry, I do exactly what John talked about and what you talked about. It's like you go there and you go through a Twitter feed where I've picked out 15, 20 things. I went to Drudge. I hover over to see who's going there. I'll click over. I'll go look at and the London story of the terrorism that's going on right now, if that's what it turns out to be, it's a pretty easy story to tell. I mean, some bad guys did some bad things overseas. So, but exactly like you guys, I don't have one or two go-to preferred sources. I have a lot.
I mean, it's so cliche, but it's the New York Times for me. But, and I actually get it at home on the weekends, and I get the LA Times too, and I try to read them all the way through, but, you know, during the week I do the same thing you guys do, and it's just like you're checking the Twitter feed and listening to the people you trust and finding the news there. And then I go to food blogs over the course of the day generally. Food 52 is awesome.
I think the Washington Post has really good political reporting.
Yes.
So I read the Washington Post, New York Times. Of course, you got to scan through your Twitter. I don't really rely on Facebook because it feels like such an echo chamber. I just can't take it. I really like Reddit. It gives you a sense of what's trending, and I like the comment section on Reddit because the comments that get the most basically likes pop to the top, and so you get it's not scientific, but you just get a sense of things better. And then, of course, you know, LA Times, and then local blogs for local issues, because we can get national stuff until we're blue in the face. But the local stuff is a lot harder to chase, and that's where I think blogs are giving better coverage than in LA. We have, you know, LA Times, Daily News. I can't find coverage on local issues. What's happening in Glendale, I couldn't tell you.
Go to the Glendale News Press, obviously.
Yeah.
I think they have one reporter.
Alice, I know you have to say the LA Times and KPCC, given your past working history. Where else do you go?
I will say I consume significantly less news now than I did as a reporter. The ones that I pay attention to that were not mentioned, KNX 1070 in Los Angeles. For sports journalism, I watch Real Sports on HBO. It's actually excellent. I think it might be the best journalism program on television. When I remember, I try to watch 60 Minutes on Sundays. I do watch The Bill Maher Show on HBO. I like Vice. Yeah, and a lot of blogs like Curbed LA, Real Deal, if I want to watch or read about development in the city. So I like the specialized blogs because I agree with you. I think that's a really good source for like specific niche topics.
Bill?
Can I just make one point about the problem with LA news sources not having reporters anymore? I once told this anecdote, and then everybody else had a story about a similar thing that had happened. But I live in Santa Barbara, but most of my work's in LA, so I'm driving back to Santa Barbara, and I'm in Encino on the 101, and traffic is like deadlocked. But I notice there's nothing's happening on the 101 on the other side. And so finally we get up to the place where it's bottlenecked. And there's a guy outside of his car, hands up, no shirt on, next to his Bentley with dark tinted windows, with a bunch of cops with assault rifles pointed at him. And I'm like, oh my God, what is going on? But LA, no reporters, I have no idea what happened there. Like, there's literally not a lick of reporting. I put it on Instagram just to see if anybody knew anything about what was happening. But I had another friend who was coming out of a show, and there were snipers on the roof next door, and they were like, yeah, no idea.
If only the mayor had been doing a slow jam, Naomi, then we would have known it.
You know, one thing is because I have such a long commute every morning, I do listen to KPCC all the way in, and then I sort of intersperse it with KNX to kind of figure out what on-the-minute kind of things are going on. And then New York Times has this podcast called The Daily, which is fascinating because they drill down for 20, 25 minutes, usually on one issue of the day. And so you are totally up to date, and they're interviewing just one or two reporters for very long, in-depth. I mean, I think this goes back to your high school student that would like to hear that. That's actually fascinating. I listen to a lot of podcasts because I'm in the car so much, so I've been able to, I'm really up to date by the time I walk in my office door.
I forgot my favorite news source. KFI AM 640, every Friday from 9 to 10 on the Bill Handel Show. I'm there, giving political analysis. That's my favorite source. Always accurate.
Self-serving and shameless, yet effective. In just a minute, I'm going to ask Tom to join us back on stage. But before he does, I want to just point out a couple of things that I've heard from this panel, particularly of this last round of questions, but frankly throughout the entire discussion. I hear them talk on one hand about the need for information and the need for speed. And I hear them talk on the other hand about the need for context and the need for perspective. And what I think they've all pointed out in slightly different ways is that these are not mutually exclusive goals. And in fact, if you're willing to rely not on just a single news source, but on a range of them, you use different types of sources for different reasons to complement each other. And I'm going to find out right away about breaking news, unless I'm Bill on the 101, of course, by looking in one direction. I need to get broader context and broader perspective that helps me make sense of the information by going elsewhere. And I'm going to turn to people who agree with me, and I'm going to turn to people who disagree with me to remind me that I'm smart, but that I'm not always right as much as I'd like to think that I am. And I think what I take away from them more than anything else is a reminder, as we referenced just briefly earlier, and I want to come back to, about the tremendous responsibility that we now have as news consumers. When I was growing up, like many of you, there were 3 anchor men, 3 white men in New York, and newspaper editors in New York and Washington and downtown Los Angeles who decided for us what was news and what was not. And that, as some of our panelists have pointed out, could be very frustrating because there was other things we wanted to know about that we didn't learn about. But for the most part, it was very comforting because we knew that Cronkite or Brinkley or Jennings was deciding for us. Well, that world doesn't exist anymore for all the reasons that our panelists have told us. And there are challenges that come with that, as they've reminded us, but tremendous opportunities as well. And I think the most important thing to take away, at least for me, that I take away from this conversation, is that this responsibility is now shifted from those news anchors and news editors to me and to each of us. And instead of someone deciding for me and for us what's news and what isn't, we have to decide that for ourselves. On one hand, that can be frustrating and aggravating, but it ought to be, at its best, it ought to be something that's very, very empowering. But it does mean responsibility for each of us, not simply to seek out our favorite news source that reassures us, that confirms that we're right, but to seek out those sources that challenge us and disagree with us. It's the same dynamic that's always existed. It's just that right now we have to make these decisions for ourselves rather than having someone to do that for us. And that is difficult, and it is frustrating. But if you're willing to take on that responsibility, as our 5 panelists have, it can be extraordinarily uplifting and reaffirming. Because no one's making that decision for me, I'm making it for myself, as long as I'm willing to take that responsibility seriously. Before I turn this back over to Tom, I want to offer a few thank yous. First of all, I neglected to mention him at the outset, and that is something for which I should apologize. But I'd ask you, in addition to the people we've already talked about, please join me in thanking the amazing Andy Gilman for the work he has done to put these programs together. Join me in thanking Bill, in thanking Ken, in thanking Alice, and thanking Naomi, and thanking John for leading us through a very, very interesting and very, very productive and important conversation. Thank you all very, very much. Please join me in thanking my wife, Cecile, because even though she doesn't stand up here for 2 hours, she and I are partners and put together these programs together, and she deserves a phenomenal amount of credit for all the good work that she's done. Thanks to Tom and Esther Wachtel, thanks to the entire host committee, thanks to Tom and Catherine for all the tremendous leadership you've shown in this community. This is something important that you all have here. We're thrilled, we're privileged to be a part of it, but it wouldn't happen without the leadership that they all show. And finally, thanks to all of you, because without you coming and being part of conversations like this one, they wouldn't happen. And the fact that you're willing to set aside time in order to participate in discussions like this speaks very well of you and speaks very well of your entire community. So please give yourselves a round of applause. You deserve it. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to ask Tom to rejoin us on the stage here. But once again, I can't tell you how grateful that Cecile and I and all of the panelists are for letting us join you here for these conversations. We're already excited for the next one. So thank you very much.
Well, it was really interesting to listen to your conversation. It was exactly what we wanted. I don't know how to thank you sufficiently. It was interesting to hear. I mean, and I was thinking about, why am I having so much fun listening to this? And I think I think it's an idea that actually comes out of the tradition of the Chautauqua. It's that it's in person. It would be different to watch you on television. Or to watch you on my computer. There is an immediacy. You get a sense of the person, and that makes the message different, knowing who that is coming from as an individual. I think that's the difference. In any case, it's wonderful, and we appreciate your being here really a lot. I have just a couple of quick things to tell you. If you want to be on our mail list, there's a place in the back where you can sign up, and we will send you our stuff. We are in the process now of developing our fall program. If there are particular things you would like us to do, if there are topics that you think would be particularly interesting under this format, let us know and we will give those consideration. And if you want to get involved in this project, we invite you to do that. The easiest way is just to send us some money. That would be fine. We would be very happy to have you do that. But we also need people to help with the work. And the work is partly coordination, and it's largely getting the word out to the community. Oddly enough, it's not an easy thing for us to do that. There are people all the time that I know that are friends that don't know anything about this thing. And they ask me about it because they heard about it, but oh gosh, it's been going on for several years. So we can use your help getting the word out, as well as doing logistical stuff, as well as money. Thank you for coming. The panelists have agreed to be down here and mill and talk if you want to ask them questions on purpose.